Hello and welcome to West Country Wanderings. Welcome to Secrets of the Thames and Severn Canal. Today we're here in Cerney Wick, famous, well, I'll show you what it's famous for in a minute if you could probably remember. What we're looking at today is something a little bit different. Now, on my regular updates on the Cotswold Canals on both the Stroudwater and the Thames and Severn Canal, we've looked at restoration sections. We've also looked at various sections of both canals, looking at their locks and the other features of the canal. What we haven't done in any of those videos, or indeed at any other of the Secrets series, both on the Stroudwater and Thames and Severn so far though, is look at exactly how the canal was constructed. And that's what I'm going to talk about today here on West Country Wanderings, so I hope you can join me for that. Let's come and have a look. So where are we today where I decided to film this? Well, I thought I'd come to probably one of the most picturesque locations on the Thames and Severn Canal. I'm actually in Wiltshire, in here at Cerney Wick, which was a Saxon settlement. I think it was at 999 on that notice board that you come into the village. And this, of course, behind me is the Cerney Wick roundhouse, probably the best preserved of all of the roundhouses on the Thames and Severn Canal. It's just a beautiful, beautiful example here. So yes, so we're here in the county of Wiltshire, not far from the Gloucestershire border. So let's see what's happening with the history of how this canal was constructed and built, because it's really fascinating. So what I hope to talk about in today's video is looking at the construction and the techniques that those early canal pioneers used to build this wonderful Thames and Severn Canal here in Gloucestershire and Wiltshire. It's a fascinating tale, and I was uncovering quite a bit when I was doing the research for this video here today. So hope you can join me for that. So the first part of this video I've decided to call Mapping the Line, because it's all about how the line was marked off. And our story starts with Robert Whitworth in 1783, and he started the line of the Sapperton Tunnel, marking out where the air shafts were with a series of coloured flags, and that's how the line of the route was planned out. There were additions to that with clothes and other people that came along to finish the mapping off. But without the line being mapped, of course, you cannot build anything. You have to have something on paper first. So how did they actually map the route of the canal? Now, Benjamin Gray's book, who you'll remember from our Stroudwater series when I looked at the dry dock near Easington the other day, his name comes up. He was also a surveyor, of course. And you also have Perry and Close, who was an engineer. Now, the tool they used, they had to take into account the fact that the Earth is spherical, it's round, because there is the curvature of the Earth. Sorry, flat Earth fans. But they needed to take that into account when they were doing this measurements because of the length, the 36 miles plus length of the Thames and Severn Canal. The sort of tools that they used, though, were very rudimentary surveyor's tools. They became more sophisticated into the 19th century, but back in the 18th century, they were quite basic. One of the tools just moved in a horizontal, not in a vertical plane, and it was equipped with chains. And you had somebody else with white arrow markers and a notebook. The equipment itself had like a telescopic device and crosshairs on it, not unlike looking through a camera with a telephoto lens on it through a viewfinder, and that was mounted on a tripod, very similar to what I'm talking to you on today here. What were the white arrows for? You might have seen this in some of the old railway photographs, man with pointy stick. Well, the arrows actually pointed to where the chain was moving each time the chain was moved along the length of the land, and it was simply written into a notebook and then marked up in a draftsman's office, presumably, onto a proper map. Of course, all of this predated the Ordnance Survey, making life more difficult for the people mapping the Thames and the Severn Canal. So we've now got our canal, our Thames and Severn Canal, on a map from the town of Stroud to where it joins the River Thames. Now, there is a little bit of a complication about where it joins the River Thames, which I'll talk about later in the video. But before you can get a spade and start digging a canal and getting down to the canal bed and constructing locks and tunnels, of course, you have to own the land, because at the present time you've just got a map. You don't own that land to do anything with it. So you have to take possession of that land in order to build the canal. But how does that process come about? Now, as you can imagine, this was not at all an easy or straightforward process. Enter stage left one Mr. James Perry, who was the chief negotiator on behalf of the Thames and Severn Canal Company, to act to buy the land for them from the landowners in this area in Gloucestershire and Wiltshire. But how exactly did he do that? And what happens when he didn't reach negotiations? Well, then things get really interesting. Now, despite this, Mr. James Perry was pretty successful in his negotiations. The landowner had a choice. They could actually sell their land outright, or they could decide to rent it on an annual basis to the Thames and Severn Canal Company. Often the landowners negotiated pretty much straight away and agreeing to sell their land, and the land value was generally determined to be around 27 or 30 years rental of the land, of what they would have got if they rented the land out for that period of time. So what sort of figure of settlement did Mr. James Perry agree for renting or selling the land? Well, in terms of rental figures, what I can establish from the archives is that it looks like it varied from between 14 shillings and 48 shillings an acre, but an often common settlement figure was around 30 shillings. But what happened? Despite those negotiations, the landowner didn't agree to either sell the land or not agree a figure. Well, then it went to like an adjudication, a bit like ACAS with trade unions. It went to independent land valuers and they established a figure. But you're probably thinking, well, so the land valuer comes to a figure and then they're represented with that figure to the landowner, and what happens if he doesn't agree again? Well, of course, then what's happening is the Thames and Severn Canal, because they've got an Act of Parliament to build their canal, they can invoke their rights. They can effectively just purchase it, end of matter. Just like that can still happen today, which is known as a compulsory purchase order. So after an agreement had been reached with Mr. James Perry, what happened next? Well, it had to be recorded, of course, and for that they went over to London and they used a London land surveyor, Mr. John Doyley, and he actually recorded in a book which he called a rough book, but it wasn't a notebook like this one which I used for my little script. It was a very ornate, and part of it's been preserved today. It had a huge black leather folder with gold gilding around the edges, beautifully written, very not rough at all, and it recorded very clearly who then owned the land after the negotiations had been completed and money had changed hands. So now we've mapped our route, the route of where we want to put our canal, the Thames and Severn Canal, here in Wiltshire and back there in Gloucestershire, of course. And we've now purchased the land. We own the land around the route of our canal. And we move on to the third and final, but probably the most important phase, and that's called cutting the cut and constructing the very canal itself. Now, things are very different towards the end of the 18th century as we would imagine them today. Now, for example, Wiltshire County Council want to build a new school, a new section of road, etc. What happens is they normally contract it out. They look for the best contractor that's going to do the best job on time for inside the budget. Well, hopefully. It doesn't always happen, but that's a general idea. And the contractor will then scale up the project, say how much it's going to cost, and then he'll farm those out, he'll subcontract out, and then meet and agree to the time scales and sign the contract. That didn't happen when this canal was built, there was no such process as contract working. So how did it come about? Now, what they used at the end of the 18th century was something called gang piecework. This was a system that involved from building and digging the mines, particularly the coal mines in the northeast of England, possibly from around the Stockton area. Where do we know that connection? Railway connection there. But yeah, they used that. They used a gang piecework to build it. But what exactly did that involve? Now, the gang masters were people like John Knock, James Jackson and Thomas Cook. Now, they weren't managers. These days we have FM, I was thinking that was something to do with radio, but it stands for facilities management. So you have contractors that are actually managers. They manage the project. These people weren't managers. They were hands-on craftsmen, but they were in charge of groups of men, more specifically navvies. They also had people that had worked in the mines. Some had worked on other projects, canal projects, like the Stourbridge Canal up in the West Midlands, and also on the Stroud Water as well. So they had varying degrees of experience, but no necessary experience dealing with groups of men and managing groups of men. And in those days, it would have been men that were navvies on building this canal. So you've got all these parties on different groups, on different projects of the canal. How did they actually construct it, and what tools did they use? Now, contrary to what we may think about civil engineering projects of the past, we think of Brunel with his fantastic bridge there at Maidenhead, wasn't it, across the River Thames, as he was coming out of Paddington to Bristol, and the many other wonderful construction projects like the Bristol Temple Mead Station, all that sort of thing. We really admire them today, so we tend to think that things in the past were built really, really well. Unfortunately, that wasn't necessarily the case with everything that was built on this canal. James Jackson actually built a bridge, and I couldn't identify where, but somewhere along this section, I do believe. And just a few weeks after he built it, with his groups of navvies, it completely collapsed because it hadn't been built properly. William Milton was also a bit of a shirker. Although he'd obviously bid for that section of the project, he hadn't done the work properly. And when he'd taken the rubble out, rather than taking it and removing it completely off site, it just shoved it under the nearest hedge. So looking at the nitty-gritty of the detail then, you've got your gang masters doing these piecemeal rates, different projects. And I'll come on to exactly how the canal was structured in which order in a bit. What tools did they use? Well, the basics for the navvy tools was a barrow, what we would use as a wheelbarrow this day. Also something called a grafting tool, very, very similar to a garden spade. Also had a shovel and something called a horsing block, but I'm not entirely sure how that was used. If you do know, please drop a comment below. I'll include a photograph of it now. So I've walked along the towpath a little bit further, and there's a footpath sign saying the River Churn, so I've headed down there because the towpath there was getting a little bit busy because it's a beautiful, beautiful day. It started off a bit chilly this morning, but now warming up. This, of course, here is one of the many, 80-odd lakes. This is the Cotswold Water Park, and there'll be two here that the next restoration section happens after the Stroud Water links up to the network at Sewell Junction. Be connecting from here, from what they call the Spine Road, the bridge there, down towards Inglesham. That's a huge project in itself, but that lies many, many years down the line, and obviously I'll be bringing you what's happening with the restoration on the Stroud Water in the meantime. Anyway, back to our story about the history of how this canal was constructed here in Wiltshire. So we have our navvies' basic tools, those rudimentary elements, spade and shovel, and horsing block, and the barrow, of course. Nothing else, no JCB, no mechanical equipment that we can rely on today, no tractors, nothing to pull the rubble out and tide it all up afterwards. It was sheer manpower and those very, very basic tools that cut the canal. But in what order was it built? Well, actually, they started in the town of Stroud, and they did that for a very, very good reason. The Stroud Water Canal had already been completed, which meant that they could bring in raw materials down or up the River Severn to Framalode, along the Stroud Water and into Stroud. And then as they completed each section, they could bring the more raw materials further along that completed section of the Thames and Severn Canal. I had a proviso to that because they did have a construction schedule. They did have a time limit to when they wanted to get the Thames and Severn Canal completed. And if they slipped back on that work, they would send other gangmasters to work on other projects, other locks, other buildings, other roundhouses even, at different stages. But fundamentally, yes, it was from Stroud going eastwards to Inglesham. Now, I'm sure you all know that the biggest engineering project across the whole of the Thames and Severn Canal was the Sapperton Tunnel. And we'll do a separate video, probably a couple of videos, looking at exactly how that fantastic tunnel was constructed hereabouts. After the Sapperton Tunnel had been completed, there was a delay, and the reason for that delay was to do with the navigation on the River Thames. Now, the original plan was to put the Thames and Severn Canal into the River Thames at Inglesham. There was a significant delay after the Sapperton Tunnel had been built to get the canal completed. The original plan was to get the Thames and Severn Canal joining up with the River Thames at Inglesham. But the reason for the delay was that the commissioners of the River Thames had agreed to make the Thames navigable between Inglesham, Lechlade, on down to Abingdon-on-Thames, where it was already navigable between there and the City of London. But that section between Abingdon and Lechlade / Inglesham had not yet been completed. And the Thames and Severn Canal company proprietors were very concerned that they'd gone to this trouble to build this very expensive and long canal going into a river that wasn't yet navigable. Now, the reason for that delay was the company proprietors of the Thames and Severn Canal were hedging their bets exactly where to position the canal to enter the River Thames. Because it hadn't been made navigable, the Thames that is, they thought they could perhaps have to divert it upstream a bit further, beyond Lechlade. But it all came good in the end. The final stage, though, was building the lock at Dudgrove, that famous Dudgrove lock, which I've yet to see because it lies in private land. It was a kind of a last-minute thought thing because there is a huge difference between the two lock basins in terms of height. You'd think they'd be more equal being a double lock, but it wasn't. It's an amazing piece of engineering either way. So on May the 7th, 1789, the final line of the canal was marked out because there'd been a question mark, presumably in both the map and the book, about exactly where it was going to go. And they built that lock there at Dudgrove. As I say, it's an amazing structure. I'll put in some old photographs that I've got of it now so you can see what it's like, but I can't take any present day ones, unfortunately. It's incredible to think that just a few months later, after they only just agreed that line, that the first boat sailed through. On 19th of November 1789, the first boat went through Dudgrove Lock to a huge fanfare. A great crowd had assembled there, and there were 12 cannon guns being fired from nearby Buscott Park, which just lies over the border in Oxfordshire. I think then it might have been Berkshire. Anyway, I digress. There was a huge celebration, and it's an amazing achievement that they actually completed the canal all the way from Stroud to Inglesham in just 6.5 years, using those rudimentary tools. No major contractor, no major manager either, just the hard work of those navvies and those few masons who are essentially craftsmen and not managers at all. Now, the completion of the Thames and Severn Canal attracted national press coverage. They would have been all over the TV news, 24-hour news. I expect they would have had TV crews there at Dudgrove Lock. In those days it was just newspapers. The Thunderer, aka the Times, picked up on it and called the achievement the greatest object in inland navigation. And I can't disagree with that. It was an incredible achievement to have completed it in 6.5 years, including the magnificent Sapperton Tunnel, which we'll look at again in a future episode here on Secrets of the Thames and Severn Canal. So that's it for today here on West Country Wanderings on the Secrets of the Thames and Severn Canal. Magnificent. I hope you enjoyed it. Learning about the history, I certainly did, doing a fair bit of research, bringing it to you today. I've only been able to bring you the scant details of it. If you'd like to know more detail than what I've covered today and read up on it, I can highly recommend a book written by Humphrey Household. I think it was written at the end of the 1960s. It was updated again in the early 80s. Probably be able to get a hold of it on one of those websites like A-Books and sort of thing, or in your local charity bookshop. have a scout round, but I'll give you the ISBN number for it and the title at the end of the video. It's highly recommended. It's very, very detailed. Hope you enjoyed it today. There'll be another one in this series and another one in my Canal series coming up very soon. All the best now. Thank you very much for watching. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Thank you.